The rain had been falling on Maddox Lane for 3 days, and by the time the morning post came, Briony Halloway had stopped expecting anything good to arrive in it. She heard the metal flap of the letterbox snap shut from where she stood at the stove, stirring a pot of porridge thin enough to see the bottom of, and she did not turn around. Letters meant bills. Bills meant the slow arithmetic of which thing would go unpaid this month. The electric, the council tax, the small loan she had taken to cover Tom's funeral 2 winters ago and never quite managed to finish repaying. She finished stirring before she went to the door. There was no urgency in her anymore, not the way there had been when she was younger and believed that hurrying could change an outcome. 41 years had taught her that outcomes arrived at their own pace, indifferent to how fast you ran toward or away from them. The mat held 3 envelopes. 2 were the dull manila of officialdom. The third was different, heavy cream stock, the kind that cost money to print on, the corners slightly foxed with age as though it had been sitting in a drawer somewhere for a long time before someone remembered to send it. Her name was written across the front in fountain pen, the ink a deep blue-black, the hand old-fashioned and certain. Mrs. B. Halloway. And beneath it, the address of the terraced house she rented in the dampest corner of a town that the rest of England had largely forgotten. There was no return address. There was a postmark, smudged but legible, a solicitor's franking from a firm in the city 200 miles south. Hartley, Vane & Co. Briony stood in the narrow hall with the cold seeping up through the floorboards into her socked feet and turned the envelope over twice, as though the back of it might explain the front. It did not. She did not recognize the firm. She did not know anyone in the city. The few people who still wrote to her by hand, and there were almost none left, used cheap paper and biros. She carried it into the kitchen and set it against the salt cellar while she ate her porridge, watching it the way you might watch a stray dog that had wandered in, warily, without committing to feeding it. The 2 manila envelopes she opened first, because she knew what they were, and there was a grim comfort in being right. A final demand, a notice about a rise in her water rates. She set them face down on the pile that lived on the windowsill, the pile that never got smaller no matter how much of it she paid. Then she picked up the cream envelope and slid it open with a butter knife. Inside was a single sheet, and folded within that sheet, a second smaller envelope, yellowed, sealed, and marked with nothing at all except a date in the corner, written in the same blue-black ink. The date was 32 years old. The letter from Hartley, Vane & Co. was brief, formal, and almost apologetic in its phrasing. It informed Mrs. Briony Halloway, née Aldous, that the firm had recently completed the administration of an estate that had been in a long and complicated probate, and that in the course of doing so they had discovered an instruction, a sealed letter, that should, by the terms of the deceased's wishes, have been delivered to her on her 18th birthday. Owing to an administrative oversight of the gravest regret, the letter said, this had not occurred. The firm extended its sincerest apologies for any distress or inconvenience the delay might have caused. They enclosed the original letter, undisturbed, exactly as it had been left with them. Should Mrs. Halloway wish to discuss the contents, the firm remained at her disposal, and a Mr. Crispin Vane would be glad to receive her at her earliest convenience. Briony read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the small, yellowed envelope for a long time without touching it. Née Aldous. No one had called her that in 20 years. She had been Briony Aldous until she married Tom and became a Halloway, and before that she had been a girl in a children's home in the north, with no family that anyone could name and no story attached to her except the one the system gave to children no one came back for. She had aged out of care at 16, worked in a laundry, then a care home, then on the tills at a supermarket that had since closed. She had never known her parents. She had been told by a social worker with kind eyes and not much information that her mother had died when Briony was an infant and that there were no other relatives traceable. That had been the whole of her origin, a single sentence, and she had built her life on top of it the way you build a house on uncertain ground, carefully, expecting subsidence. And here was a letter, 32 years old, addressed to her in a hand she had never seen, sent by a solicitor she had never heard of, on behalf of someone who had died and left in a state complicated enough to take decades to settle. Her hands were not quite steady when she finally picked up the small envelope. The wax seal had long since gone brittle. It cracked when she pried it, flaking onto the kitchen table like old skin. She unfolded the single page inside. "My dear Briony," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and the arrangements I have made have either succeeded or failed in ways I cannot now foresee. I have written this on the day you turned 6, though you will not read it for many years yet, and I am writing it because I do not trust the people around me to tell you the truth when the time comes, and because I have come to understand that I may not live to tell you myself. You will have been told that your mother died and that you had no one. The first part is true. The second is a lie, and it was a lie told for a reason by people who profited from it. I am your grandmother. My name is Constance Aldous, and the family you were told did not exist is, I am sorry to say, very real, very wealthy, and very determined that you should never know it." Briony stopped reading. The porridge had gone cold in its bowl. Outside, the rain kept on against the window, and somewhere down the lane a car passed, its tires hissing on the wet road. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way she had not been a moment before. She read on. "I cannot tell you everything in a letter, and I will not tell you what I cannot prove. But I can tell you this much, and you must hold on to it. There is a house. There is a name. And there is something that was taken from your mother before you were born, something that by every right and every law should have come to you. The people who took it are clever, and they are patient, and they will have spent the years since my death making sure that you remained exactly where you are, unknowing, unfindable, and poor enough that no one would ever think to ask why. If this letter reaches you, it means one of two things has happened. Either someone has made a mistake or someone has had a change of heart. Either way, the door that was shut to you has opened a crack. I beg you, my dear, do not be afraid to walk through it. You were not abandoned. You were hidden. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. Go to Hartley, Vane & Co. Ask for the file that bears my name. Tell them you are Constance Aldous' granddaughter and that you have read her letter. They will know what it means. And whatever they tell you, whatever anyone tells you, remember that you are the rightful one, not the convenient one, not the forgotten one, the rightful one. With more love than I was ever permitted to show you. Your grandmother, Constance." Briony Halloway sat very still in her cold kitchen in the forgotten town, holding a letter from a dead woman she had never known, and felt the foundations of the carefully built house of her life shift beneath her. For a long moment she did not move at all. Then, slowly, methodically, because she was a woman who had learned that the only way through anything was one careful step at a time, she reached for the solicitor's letter again and looked at the telephone number printed at the bottom. She did not call it, not yet. She had learned, too, that you did not pick up a thing that might be a trap until you had looked at it from every side. Instead, she went to the cupboard under the stairs, where she kept the few documents that constituted the paper trail of her existence. Her birth certificate, Tom's death certificate, the worn folder of papers from the children's home that a sympathetic clerk had given her years ago when she'd asked, on a whim she'd never fully understood, for whatever records still existed. She had read that folder once, long ago, and put it away because it had told her nothing. Now she took it out and read it again, and this time she read it the way her grandmother's letter had taught her to, as something that had been written by people with reasons. The folder said her mother's name had been Eleanor Aldous. It said Eleanor had died of complications following childbirth in a hospital in the south of England, not the north, where Briony had grown up. It said the infant Briony had been transferred north at the request of family, and placed into care, no family traceable. Those two phrases sat in the same document, 3 lines apart, and contradicted each other so plainly that Briony could not understand how she had read them a dozen times before without seeing it. At the request of family. No family traceable. Someone had requested. And then that someone had vanished, made themselves untraceable, left a 6-year-old's granddaughter to be raised by the state 200 miles from where she'd been born. Hidden, not abandoned, hidden. Briony closed the folder. The rain had eased to a drizzle. She made herself a cup of tea, the proper way, warming the pot, and drank it slowly at the kitchen table with both letters laid out in front of her. And she let herself think, really think, for the first time in years, about what she actually knew. She knew she was not a fool, whatever the world had decided about her. She had taught herself bookkeeping in the evenings during her years at the care home, and had run the home's accounts for 3 years before a new manager arrived who preferred to give the work to his nephew. She had a memory that did not let go of things. She could recite, even now, the inventory of the supermarket stockroom she had managed before it closed, aisle by aisle. She had read more in the public library than most people read in universities, working through the shelves in order, history and law and biography and accountancy, not because anyone had told her to, but because reading was free and despair was expensive. She had simply never had a single occasion in her life where any of it mattered to anyone but herself. She looked at the name at the bottom of the old letter, Constance, and she thought perhaps it matters now. She decided 2 things before she finished her tea. The first was that she would go to the city and speak to Mr. Crispin Vane, but she would not telephone ahead, because a person who telephoned ahead gave the people on the other end time to prepare a version of events. She would arrive as a stranger and watch their faces when she said the name. The second was that she would tell no one, not her neighbor Pat, not the woman at the food bank who had become something like a friend, not anyone, until she understood what she was walking into. She had £11 and 40 pence in her purse, and another 30-odd in a tin on the mantel. The train fare to the city would take nearly all of it. She would go anyway. A woman who had been hidden for 41 years could afford to spend her last few pounds finding out who had hidden her. That night Briony did not sleep much. She lay in the narrow bed in the back room and listened to the house settling around her and turned the letters' phrases over in her mind. Very wealthy, very determined, the rightful one. She was not a woman who indulged in fantasies. Life had cured her of that early, and she did not let herself imagine mansions or fortunes. But she did let herself imagine, just once, the faces of people who had looked at a small child and decided she was an inconvenience to be removed, and she found that the imagining produced in her not self-pity but something colder and steadier and far more useful: resolve. In the morning she dressed in her best clothes, which were not good but were clean and pressed, because she understood that the world treated you according to how you presented yourself, and she did not intend to be dismissed before she had even spoken. She put both letters into a plain folder, and the folder into a canvas bag, and she walked to the station through the thin gray light with her back straight. The train south took 4 hours. She watched the country change through the window, the moors giving way to flat farmland, the farmland to the sprawl and glitter of the city. And she did not let herself rehearse what she would say, because she had found that rehearsed words came out stiff, and that the truth, plainly spoken, unsettled liars far more. Hartley, Vane & Co. occupied 3 floors of a handsome stone building in a quiet square near the old courts, the sort of address that announced, without needing to say so, that its occupants had been doing the same quiet, expensive work for a very long time. Briony stood across the street for a few minutes, looking at the brass plate beside the door, the polished windows, the discreet wealth of it all. Then she crossed the street and went in. The receptionist was a young man with a careful smile that flickered just slightly when he took in her clothes and her canvas bag. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," Briony said, "My name is Briony Halloway. I'd like to see Mr. Crispin Vane. He wrote to me." She set the cream envelope on the desk, face up, so that the firm's own franking showed. "It concerns the estate of Constance Aldous." The young man's smile did not so much fade as freeze. He looked at the envelope, then at her, then picked up his telephone and turned slightly away, lowering his voice, though not so much that she could not hear him say the name Aldous, and then, after a pause, "No, she's here. In reception. Now." There was a silence on the line. Then the young man set down the phone, and when he turned back his careful smile had been replaced by something more careful still. "Mr. Vane will see you," he said, "if you'd come with me." Briony picked up her envelope and followed him toward the stairs, and as she climbed she felt the strange, vertiginous sensation of a door, the one her grandmother had written of, the one that had been shut for 41 years, beginning, at last, to open. What lay on the other side of it she did not yet know. But she had not come all this way to be told again that there was no one and nothing and no family traceable. She had come to find out who had written no family traceable in a child's file, and why, and what it was they had been so determined she should never have. She intended to find out all of it, and then she intended to take it back. Mr. Crispin Vane was not what Briony had expected, and she had learned long ago that the gap between what you expected and what arrived was where the truth usually lived. She had pictured a smooth man in an expensive suit, the sort who would meet her dismissal with dismissal of his own. Instead, the man who rose from behind the broad desk on the second floor was old, genuinely old, perhaps 75, with white hair gone wispy at the crown and a slight stoop, and a face that, when it took her in, did something Briony had not seen on a stranger's face in a very long time. It went pale, not surprised, pale, as though he were looking at someone he had given up for dead. "Mrs. Halloway," he said, and his voice was not quite steady, "forgive me, you have a great look of her." "Of whom?" "Your grandmother." He gestured to the chair across the desk, and his hand, she noticed, was trembling. "Please, sit. I have waited a long time to be wrong about something, and I find I am not enjoying being right." Briony sat. She placed her canvas bag on her lap and her folded hands on top of it and waited. She had found that silence drew more out of people than questions did. Most people could not bear the weight of it. They filled it, and what they used to fill it told you a great deal. Crispin Vane did not fill it at once. He sat back down heavily, and for a moment he simply looked at her clean, cheap clothes and her work-roughened hands and her straight back, and something moved behind his old eyes that might have been grief and might have been shame and was probably both. "The letter reached you," he said at last. "Good, that at least is one thing made right, though 32 years late, and I am the only man alive who knows why." He drew a breath. "Mrs. Halloway, what do you know? Tell me plainly, so I do not tell you things you already have, or assume you have things you do not." "I know almost nothing," Briony said. "I was raised in care in the North. I was told my mother died and there was no family. My grandmother's letter says that was a lie. It says there is a house and a name and something that was taken from my mother that should have come to me, and it says you would know what that means." She paused. "It says I am the rightful one, not the convenient one." Those were her words. The old man closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," he said, "those would be her words. Constance had a way of putting things that lodged in you and would not leave." He opened a drawer in the desk slowly, the joints of his hand stiff, and took out a file. It was thick, bound with a faded ribbon, and across its cover was written, in a clerk's careful hand, "Aldous C. Private." He set it on the desk between them but did not open it. "I am going to tell you a story," he said, "and you are going to want to disbelieve parts of it because no decent person likes to think the world arranges itself this way. But I have the documents to support every word, and you may read them at your leisure. I will not ask you to take anything on my word alone. I gave my word once, you see, to your grandmother, and I broke it. Not through malice, through cowardice and through trust misplaced. That is its own kind of malice, I have come to think. The kind that wears a respectable face. Briony said nothing. She watched him. Your grandmother, Constance Aldous, was a remarkable woman, Vane began. She came from nothing, a mill town, much like the one you were sent to, which I do not think was an accident. She married a man named Edmund Aldous, who came from a great deal of something. The Aldous family had been shipbuilders for 4 generations, and when the shipbuilding declined, they were clever enough to turn the money into other things, property mostly, and a controlling interest in a manufacturing concern that did very well through the latter half of the last century. By the time Constance married into it, the family was wealthy in the way that old families are wealthy, quietly, with most of it tied up in a trust, and a great deal of energy spent making sure it stayed in the right hands. And Constance was not the right hands, Briony said. Constance was a Milltown girl who married the heir, and the family never forgave either of them for it. Vane's mouth tightened. But Edmund loved her, and Edmund held the controlling share, and so for as long as he lived, what the rest of the family thought did not signify. They had one child, a daughter, Eleanor. The name went through Briony like cold water. My mother. Your mother, he nodded, Eleanor Aldous. By every account she was as remarkable as Constance, clever, headstrong, kind in a way that the family found frankly embarrassing. She had no interest in the money. She trained as a nurse of all things, much to the horror of her aunts, and she went to work in a hospital in the South, and there she met a man. He paused. A young doctor. His name does not appear in the family records because the family took considerable trouble to make sure it would not. They were not married, there was no time. Eleanor fell pregnant, and she was happy about it, and she wrote to her mother that she intended to raise the child herself, and the family could disapprove all it liked. And then she died. And then she died. The old man's voice dropped. In childbirth, the records say. The complications were real, Mrs. Halloway. I want to be clear about that because I have wondered over the years whether even that was, but no. The medical records are genuine. Your mother died of an eclamptic seizure, and the doctors of that day could do little for it. That part is simply the cruelty of nature. What followed was the cruelty of people. Briony's hands had tightened on the bag. She made them loosen. Go on. Edmund, your grandfather, had died 2 years before, which meant that when Eleanor died, the controlling share of the Aldous Trust passed under its terms to Eleanor's heir, her child. He looked at Briony steadily. You, an infant, 3 days old, with no father on record and a grandmother grieving 200 miles away. You were, from the moment of your mother's death, the single largest shareholder in the Aldous Trust. You held, in your tiny, unknowing fist, control of a fortune. The rain had stopped outside. Briony was aware of the sounds of the office below, a telephone, a printer, the ordinary machinery of a quiet day, and of how strange it was that the world should go on making those sounds while a man told her this. What happened, she said. It was not quite a question. Edmund's brother happened, Vane said. Gerald Aldous, your great-uncle, a man who had spent his entire life watching the controlling share sit with his brother, and then with his brother's foreign-born wife, and then, intolerably, passed toward a bastard infant whose father was a hospital doctor nobody had heard of. Gerald was not going to permit it, and Gerald was clever, and Gerald was patient, and Gerald had something that Constance, in her grief, did not have in those first crucial weeks. He had lawyers in the room. Your lawyers, Briony said quietly. Crispin Vane did not look away, and she respected him a little for that. My firm's, yes. My father's at the time. I was a young man, newly qualified, and I did as I was told. Gerald's argument was simple and on its face reasonable. An infant cannot hold a controlling share. A guardian must be appointed to vote it. Constance, he argued, was unfit, grief-stricken, of common origin, with no head for business. He proposed himself as guardian of the child and trustee of her share until her majority. And he proposed something else. Vane's jaw worked. He proposed that the child be placed where she would be, his word, protected. Away from the press, away from fortune hunters, away, he said, from the destabilizing influence of an unbalanced grandmother. He proposed that you be quietly placed into care under a sealed arrangement, your origins not disclosed until such time as you were old enough to be reintroduced. And he never intended to reintroduce me. He never intended you to be found at all. The old man's voice was very low now. The plan, Mrs. Halloway, was that you would age out of care knowing nothing, that the trust's controlling share would remain under Gerald's guardianship, in perpetuity through one legal device after another, and that you would live and die a stranger to your own name. And it very nearly worked. It worked for 41 years. Briony sat with it. She had thought on the train that she had prepared herself for something large. She found now that she had not. There is no preparing for the discovery that your entire life, its poverty, its smallness, its grinding, careful arithmetic of bills had been manufactured, that you had not failed to inherit anything, that you had been robbed deliberately as an infant by a man with lawyers in the room, and that the robbery had been so complete that you had spent 4 decades blaming the wrong thing for your circumstances. Bad luck, the world, yourself. Where was my grandmother in all this? She asked. She wrote that letter when I was 6. She was alive. Why did she not come for me? She tried. Vane reached into the file and drew out a thin sheaf of papers, yellowed like the letter. She tried for the rest of her life. These are her petitions, her letters to the firm, her letters to Gerald. Her attempts to discover where you had been placed, which Gerald had ensured she could not learn, because the placement was sealed and the records altered, and she was, with every passing year, painted more thoroughly as the obsessed, unbalanced woman Gerald needed her to be. He had money and he had patience and he had respectability, and she had grief and the truth. And in this world, Mrs. Halloway, those are not evenly matched. She spent everything she had fighting him. She died 14 years ago, in a rented room not unlike the one I suspect you live in now, still writing letters no one answered. The last thing she did was lodge that sealed letter with this firm, with instructions that it be delivered to you on your 18th birthday, by which time, she hoped, the worst of Gerald's people would be gone and someone might at last do the decent thing. And no one did. And no one did. The instruction was misfiled. Whether by accident or by a hand that was paid, I cannot prove Gerald still had reach within this firm even then, and I was not yet senior enough to see every shadow. By the time I rose to discover it, the deadline had long passed, and he stopped. His old face was full of something terrible. I told myself it was too late. I told myself the harm was done and could not be undone, and that to raise it would only cause pain and scandal. I told myself a great many comfortable things, Mrs. Halloway, for a great many years. And then 6 months ago Gerald Aldous finally died at the age of 94, having outlived everyone who might have stopped him. And in administering his estate we were obliged to open files that had been sealed for decades. And I found her letter, still waiting, still addressed to you. And I found that I was old and near my own end, and that I did not wish to die having let a clever, wicked man win, simply because winning was easier for everyone but the one person it was stolen from. He pushed the thick file across the desk toward her. So I sent it, he said, 32 years late. Against the advice of my partners, who would very much prefer that this firm's role in the original arrangement remain undisturbed. I sent it because your grandmother was right about you before you were born, Mrs. Halloway. She wrote, in one of these petitions, he found the page, and his finger trembled on the line. She wrote that the family had made one error in their calculations. They assumed that a child raised with nothing would grow into nothing. But she is a leaner's daughter and my granddaughter, she wrote, and the women of this line do not grow into nothing. They grow quiet, and they grow patient, and they wait. And one day the door will open a crack, and God help the people standing behind it. Briony looked at the file, ALDOUSC private. She did not open it yet. She was thinking. with the cold, clear part of her mind that had carried her through every hard year, about what the old solicitor had not quite said. "Gerald is dead," she said slowly. "So who has the share now? The controlling share. My mother's share. If it was never lawfully transferred, if I was the heir all along, then for 41 years, whoever has been voting it has been voting something that was never theirs to vote." Crispin Vane smiled then for the first time, and it was a thin, fierce, surprising smile on his tired old face. "There," he said softly. "There it is. That is the question your grandmother said you would ask if the letter ever reached a woman and not a stranger. That is the question they have spent 41 years, and a great deal of money, ensuring no one would ever be in a position to ask." He folded his trembling hands. The share passed, on Gerald's manipulation, into a holding entity controlled by the family, and on his death, control of that entity passed to his son. Your first cousin once removed. A man named Rupert Aldous. He is, at this moment, the chairman of the Aldous concern, a man whose photograph appears in the financial press, who sits on charitable boards, who is regarded as the very model of inherited respectability. He is also, Mrs. Halloway, in possession of a controlling interest that the law, the actual law, not the version his grandfather purchased, says has belonged to you since you were 3 days old. Along with, I should add, 41 years of dividends, reinvested and compounded, which a competent forensic accountant could trace, and a court could order restored. "Worth how much?" Briony asked. Her voice did not shake, she was rather proud of that. The old man named a figure. For a moment Briony Halloway, who had £11 and 40 pence in her purse that morning, sat in a quiet office in the city, and looked at a number so large it had no meaning, the way a word repeated too many times stops being a word. Then the meaning settled into her, and with it came not joy, joy would come later, or perhaps it never would, but something harder and more immediate. The understanding that she now possessed a truth that powerful people had killed a fortune to keep buried, and that the moment she walked out of this building with this file under her arm, she would become, to Rupert Aldous and everyone whose comfort depended on him, the single most dangerous person in England. "He doesn't know I exist," she said, "does he?" "He believes the infant heir vanished into the care system 200 miles away and was never traceable," Vane said. "He believes, as his grandfather arranged for the whole world to believe, that you are a closed file, a loose end long since tied off." He met her eyes. "He does not know that you are sitting in my office. He does not know your grandmother's letter survived. He does not know that you read and think and wait, and that you have just asked the one question. But he will learn all of it, the moment we act. And he will not be gentle, Mrs. Halloway. The Aldous family has buried this once. Believe me when I tell you that a family which arranged the disappearance of an infant will not balk at the inconvenience of a grown woman." Briony sat very still. Outside, the city went about its business. Below her in the building, telephones rang and printers hummed. And inside her, slowly, something that had been folded up small and quiet for 41 years began, at last, to unfold. She reached out and pulled the file toward her. She untied the faded ribbon, and she began to read, not as the convenient one, not as the forgotten one, but as the rightful one, learning at last the true shape of the thing that had been stolen, and beginning, line by careful line, to plan exactly how she was going to take it back. She did not look up for a long time. When she finally did, the light through the office window had shifted toward afternoon, and Crispin Vane was watching her with the expression of a man who had set something in motion that could no longer be stopped, and was, for the first time in 32 years, glad of it. "I'll need a copy of everything," Briony said, "and I'll need to understand the trust law properly, not just the parts you choose to tell me. And I'll need to know who in this firm can be trusted and who answers, even now, to the Aldous money." She closed the file. "Because the first thing they'll try to do when they learn I'm real is make me disappear again, and I have spent my whole life being made to disappear. I don't intend to allow it twice." The old solicitor looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached across the desk, and to her surprise he took her work-roughened hand in both of his trembling ones and held it. "Your grandmother," he said, "would have been very proud, and Gerald Aldous, wherever he is, has just begun to lose." The thing about being poor, Briony had often thought, was that it taught you to be unhurried. Money made people impatient, it let them buy speed, and speed made them careless. She had no money, and so she had only patience, and she had decided in Crispin Vane's office that patience would be the weapon she fought with, because it was the one weapon the Aldous family had never learned to defend against. They had crushed Constance because Constance, mad with grief and love, had been in a hurry to reach her grandchild. Briony was in a hurry for nothing. She had waited 41 years to learn the truth. She could wait a little longer to use it. So she did not march into the Aldous offices. She did not call the press. She did not, in those first weeks, do anything at all that Rupert Aldous would have recognized as an attack, because she understood that the moment he recognized her as a threat, his money would close around her like a fist. Instead, she went home to the cold terraced house on Maddox Lane, and she carried on to all outward appearances, exactly as before: the food bank, the unpaid bills, the thin porridge. And in the evenings, by the light of a single lamp, she built her case. Crispin Vane had given her copies of everything: Constance's petitions, the original guardianship arrangement, the altered placement records, the trust deed itself. He had also given her, quietly, the name of a forensic accountant, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Priya Sandhu, who took on cases that other firms found too dangerous or too dull, and who, when Briony laid the file in front of her, went very quiet and then said, "Mrs. Halloway, I have audited fraud for 20 years. I have never seen anything this old, this large, or this clean. Whoever built this knew exactly what they were doing." And then, after a pause, "I want this one. I'll do it at cost." It took 4 months. 4 months of Priya tracing the controlling share through the holding entity Gerald had built, through the shell companies and the trust devices, through 41 years of dividends reinvested and compounded, every transaction a thread that led, eventually, back to the single original theft. An infant's inheritance, voted by a man with no right to vote it. 4 months in which Briony learned the trust law not in summary, but in full, sitting in the public library exactly as she always had, working through the statutes and the case reports in order, until she understood the machinery of her own dispossession better than the lawyers Rupert Aldous paid to defend it. 4 months in which she told no one, not Pat, not the woman at the food bank, and went on being, to her town, the quiet poor widow she had always been. And Rupert Aldous, 200 miles south, went on being the model of inherited respectability, photographed at his charitable galas, quoted in the financial press, entirely unaware that the closed file his grandfather had tied off so neatly was sitting in a cold northern kitchen, reading the trust deed by lamplight and circling the clauses that would undo him. It was Priya who found the thing that turned a strong case into an unanswerable one. Late one night she telephoned Briony, and her voice had an edge to it Briony had not heard before. "Constance was cleverer than any of us," Priya said. "She knew she'd never win in her lifetime, so she didn't try to win. She tried to make it impossible to forge. There's a clause in the original trust deed, Edmund's deed, the real one, before Gerald got near it. It requires that any transfer of the controlling share be countersigned by the firm's senior partner and recorded with a specific independent registrar. Gerald never did it. He couldn't. The registrar would have flagged that the heir was a living minor, so he rooted around it with the guardianship device. Which means, Mrs. Halloway, that as a matter of law the controlling share was never transferred at all. For 41 years it has sat, untransferred, in the name of its lawful holder. Every vote Gerald cast, every vote Rupert has cast since, every single one was void. The company has been run, this entire time, on a share that legally still belongs to you, not a claim to recover it. It never left you." Briony sat in her dark kitchen and held the telephone and looked at the rain on the window. And for the first time since the envelope had arrived, something in her chest came loose, and she found she was crying not for the fortune, which still meant nothing real to her, but for Constance, dead in a rented room, who had hidden a key inside the lock itself and trusted that one day a granddaughter clever and patient enough would come and turn it. "Then we don't sue to recover anything," Briony said when she could speak. "We simply prove what's already true. And we do it where he can't bury it." The Aldous concern held its annual general meeting in November, in the great paneled hall of a livery company in the old city, before its shareholders and the financial press. Rupert Aldous chaired it every year from a raised table at the front, and every year it was a formality. The votes a foregone conclusion, the chairman's control absolute, because the chairman controlled the share that controlled everything. It was, Briony decided, the perfect room. Not a courtroom, where it could be sealed and delayed and drowned in money. A public room, full of the very people whose respect Rupert Aldous had spent his life purchasing, on the one day of the year when the law required the door to be open to any shareholder who held a share. And Briony Halloway held a share, the largest one. She had held it for 41 years. She did not arrive in a borrowed grand outfit. She came in her own clean, cheap clothes, the ones she had worn to Crispin Vane's office, because she had decided that she would not enter that room pretending to be anything other than exactly what they had made her. She came with Priya Sandhu on one side and Crispin Vane, frail now, walking with a stick, but upright on the other. And she carried a plain folder, the same canvas bag, and the original sealed envelope, its broken wax still clinging to the flap. The clerk at the door asked for her shareholding. "I'd like that recorded carefully," Briony said, and gave her name, Halloway, née Aldous. Daughter of Eleanor Aldous, granddaughter of Constance and Edmund. The clerk's pen stopped. Words, she knew, would now move through the room ahead of her, the way water finds a crack, and that was exactly what she wanted. By the time she walked into the paneled hall and took a seat near the back among the minor shareholders, half the room was already turning to look, and at the raised table at the front, a tall, silver-haired man in an immaculate suit had gone still. Rupert Aldous was 60, handsome in the bloodless way of men who have never wanted for anything, and Briony watched him receive the name the way Crispin Vane had received it 4 months before, except that where the old solicitor had gone pale with grief, Rupert went pale with calculation. She saw him lean to the man beside him, saw the whispered conference, saw a runner dispatched. He was, she understood, already trying to find out how to make her disappear. He had inherited the instinct along with the share. It was the only thing his grandfather had truly left him. He tried first to deny her the floor. When the formal business reached the point where shareholders might speak, and Briony rose, the chairman's voice came smooth and amplified from the front. "I'm afraid we can't recognize unverified claimants. If this person has a matter, she may submit it to the company's secretary in writing, and it will be considered in due course." A ripple of relieved laughter from the people near the front, who knew which side their bread was buttered. Briony did not sit down. "My shareholding has been verified by your own clerk at the door," she said, and her voice, unamplified, carried in the sudden quiet because she did not raise it. She had learned long ago that a quiet voice in a loud room makes everyone lean in. "I hold the controlling share of this company. I have held it for 41 years. I'd like to ask the chairman a question about the share he believes is his." "This is absurd," Rupert said, and now there was something underneath the smoothness. "Security." "Before you do that," Briony said, "you should know that everything I am about to say is supported by documents lodged this morning with the independent registrar named in your founding trust deed, with a forensic auditor's certified report, and with a national newspaper, under embargo, to be released at noon. Removing me from this room will not remove any of that. It will only ensure that the photograph of you having me removed appears beside the report." She let that settle. "I genuinely advise you to let me finish. It's the last advice from this family you're ever likely to get for free." The security men, who had started forward, stopped, looking to the table for instruction that did not come. Rupert Aldous sat with his hand half raised, and Briony watched him do the arithmetic of a powerful man who has just realized that the unhurried woman at the back of the room has been moving for months while he sat still, and that she is not at the beginning of her attack. She is at the end of it. She told them then, plainly in order, the way she did everything. She told them about Edmund's trust deed and the clause that required the registrar's countersignature. She told them about Alina, the nurse, dead 3 days after giving birth to the lawful heir. She told them about Gerald and the guardianship device and the sealed placement and the words "no family traceable" written into a child's file by people with lawyers in the room. She told them about Constance, who had spent her life and her last penny petitioning a firm that had misfiled her granddaughter's letter for 32 years. She held up the envelope with the broken seal. And then she let Priya Sandhu, in 4 flat unanswerable minutes, lay out the audit, the untransferred share, the void votes, the 41 years of dividends that had, as a matter of law, never stopped belonging to the infant in the file. "So you see," Briony finished, "I am not here to make a claim. There is nothing to claim. The share is mine and always was. Your chairman has merely been voting it without permission, as his grandfather did before him. I came here to do, on the public record, the one thing your family has spent 41 years and a great deal of money preventing." She looked at Rupert Aldous, and for the first time she let the room see what was underneath her own quiet. "I came to be counted. My name is Briony Aldous. I am Alina's daughter, and I am no longer a closed file." For a moment there was no sound at all in the great paneled hall, and then the room, the shareholders, the press, the very people whose respect Rupert had spent his life buying, began, slowly, to turn away from the raised table and toward the woman at the back in the cheap clean clothes. It was not applause. It was worse than applause for Rupert. It was the quiet, decisive shift of a room reassigning its respect, and there is no fortune large enough to buy that back once it moves. The end came faster than the long, slow building of it. Rupert Aldous fought. Of course, men like him always fight, because the alternative is admitting that the ground they stood on was never theirs. But Constance had built the case to be unforgeable, and Priya had built the audit to be unanswerable, and Crispin Vane, in the months before he died that winter, gave a sworn deposition that closed the last door. A confession, finally, of his firm's part in the original arrangement, made not to save himself but to make sure that this time, at last, the truth would not be misfiled. The courts did not so much rule in Briony's favor as confirm that there had never been anything to rule on. The share was hers. It always had been. The dividends were ordered restored. And the question of how a respectable family had arranged the disappearance of an infant heir, and how a respectable law firm had let her grandmother's letter sit in a drawer for 32 years, became precisely the public scandal that the Aldous money had spent 4 decades and a fortune preventing, now spent, and gone, and unable to prevent it any longer. Rupert Aldous resigned the chairmanship before he could be removed from it. The board he had controlled absolutely voted, in the end, with a controlling share that was no longer his to direct, and the irony of that was not lost on anyone. He was not imprisoned, his crime was his grandfather's, and the law is gentler with inheritance than with infants. But he lost the thing he had been raised to believe was the only thing, the respect of the rooms he moved in. He had been, his whole life, the model of inherited respectability, and he was left, at the end, with the inheritance and none of the respectability, which Briony thought was a more exact justice than any prison. She did not move into a mansion. People expected her to, and she found their expectation revealing. They assumed that what she had wanted all along was the things. She had not wanted the things. She had wanted the truth and her name and the chance to stand in a room and be counted. The money she largely gave away, and not vaguely. She endowed, in Constance's name, A fund for the children who age out of care with nothing and no story attached to them. The ones the system writes off in a single sentence the way it had written her off. She paid quietly the debts of the food bank that had fed her. She bought the cold terraced house on Maddox Lane and kept it, not out of sentiment but because she had decided she would not let the place that had held her at her lowest be the thing she was ashamed of. It had held her. She had survived it. That was not shame. That was the proof of what she was. Crispin Vane did not live to see the final judgment. He died that February in his sleep, an old man who had carried a broken promise for 32 years and set it right at the very end. He left Briony a letter of his own, brief and unsentimental, and the last line of it she kept folded in her purse for the rest of her life. You asked me, the first day, who in my firm could be trusted. The honest answer was, no one, including me. We are made trustworthy, Mrs. Halloway, only by the moment we choose to be, and most of us choose too late. You gave an old man the chance to choose, finally, before the end. I am grateful. Your grandmother was right about you, as she was right about everything, and far too early. There is a thing Briony came to understand in the quiet years that followed, and she said it once, to a young woman from the Care Fund who had come to thank her and had asked, with a kind of desperate hope, whether there was a letter coming for her too, a grandmother, a fortune, a door about to open. And Briony had taken her hands, the way Crispin Vane had once taken hers, and told her the truth, because the truth was the only inheritance she fully trusted. Most of you will not get a letter, she said. I want to be honest with you about that, because hope built on a letter that never comes is just another way of being made to disappear. The fortune was real, but it was never the point. The point is this: they hid me because they were afraid of what I was, not what I had nothing. What I was, and they were right to be afraid because what I was could not be taken, only hidden, and a hidden thing waits. You were not abandoned, you were hidden. There is a difference, and the difference is everything, and no one, no family, no system, no powerful man with lawyers in the room can hide what you are forever. They can only make you wait. So learn while you wait. Read while you wait. Grow quiet and grow patient, and do not believe the single sentence they wrote about you. And one day the door will open a crack. And God help the people standing behind it.